We will certainly come to the controversy a little later on. For now, I would love to get to know a bit more about Kavi Santokh Singh. Who is he? What does he do? What happens to him? And another point which I was probably going to save towards the end when we discuss the Singh Sabha period and kind of everything that goes on there, although I now feel it's the kind of better place to just mention, which is that time period is often characterized as like a decline of Sikhi, but yet we've got the work of Kavi Santokh Singh Ji coming out in literally the heart of this. So how does that, like, what does Kavi Santokh Singh Ji's work say to us about that time period?
This is a good question, and we'll slowly unpack this. But so Santokh Singh is born in the late 18th century, so he's born in 1787. He's born in his lineage. His family is of a rather lower caste, Chimba, just like Namdev. And so by all means, at that point, he's coming from a really, unprivileged kind of background. He's born to, his father's name is Deva Singh. We know all this information just based on basically how he writes about it in his own text. So he's born to Deva Singh, and I'm not sure if he lists his mother's name there, but he praises both of them in his text for an upbringing. Deva Singh apparently taught him Gurbani. He was quite a smart kid at the age of 10, 11. Deva Singh then entrusts him in the heart of the Sikh community in Amritsar at the Akal Takht, at the Gyaniya Bunga. So this is really important when learning about Santokh Singh and kind of his creations, is that Santokh Singh is trained in the heart of the Sikh community. Santokh Singh is not somebody who is kind of on the outskirts or somebody who is part of, let's say, for example, and this is speaking very loosely, like he's part of an Udasi order, or he's part of a Nirmala order, or he's part of a, let's say, even like a Nahang order. Like he is at the heart of the community here. The Gyaniya Bunga, for those who don't know, is kind of this a tradition, this lineage of a teaching institution based at the Akal Takht, coming back to Bhai Mani Singh, his writings, like the Guru Bilas Bachai Chemi, Bachai Dasmi, these writings come out of the Gyaniya Bunga essentially. So he's trained by basically the most learned Sikh, Gyani Sant Singh. Gyani Sant Singh is, the head of the Gyaniya Bunga at that point. He writes, his literature, by the way, blows away people at that time. And it's something that's really interesting, but it's kind of really lost on the Sikh community at this point. He writes, commentary on Tulsidas's Ramayana Ramachartamanas. And it's so widely known and kind of praised that people are in shock across India, being like, some Gyani in Amritsar wrote like this exquisite text. And this information came out only when I was reading about Ramachartamanas in other classes, outside of the Sikh field. And that name came up, Sant Singh. And I was like, oh my God, that's the same Sant Singh from the Gyani Bunga. Anyway, so that's something that needs to be unpacked in further research as well. But Sant Singh was just, an exquisite scholar in Sanskrit and Braj. And that's where Santokh Singh kind of cuts his teeth. He's learning Sanskrit, he's learning Braj Pasha there. And, he spends a significant amount of time there, I think 5 to 10 years with Sant Singh, learning before he goes off and begins traveling and collecting stories of the gurus. And that's something as well that Santokh Singh is really renowned for, is that he would kind of travel around. Leitner actually mentioned this in his text, saying that Santokh Singh is just known for traveling across, collecting stories, writing stories, etc. So he's trained in kind of this, in the heart of the Sikh community at that point. This is early 1800s, and then he kind of bounces around. Santokh Singh does, writing different compositions. He wrote his Nanak Prakash in 1820s. Eventually, he lands in Patiala in the princely state. Karam Singh, Raja Karam Singh provides him with some patronage. And then he moves over to the princely state of Gathal, which in 1843 gets taken over by the British. But until then, Santokh Singh would stay there, receiving generous patronage from Uday Singh, the Raja there. And that's where he would write the majority of his works.
I wanted to ask them, once the British arrive, what happens to Kavi Santokh Singh? What's his fate?
Yeah, it's this really interesting part, because Santokh Singh ends his Suraj Prakash talking about this. So Uday Singh doesn't have a son. He passes away. The state kind of goes into chaos. Gathal, that princely state. The British come in and they just loot everything. They steal everything. He talks about this actually in the last couple of lines. He says, "Thankfully, the Guru has given his hand and he's protected me. Like not even a hair on my head has been bent." Um, so Santokh Singh, by all means, apparently is saved from any type of physical harm at that point, but his body is not well. He's sick at that point. So when the British come in, they steal everything, they loot all that area, and then he moves up to Amritsar to, provide that text to the Akal Takht. And then the historical information so far is a little bit, gray. It's unclear. It's something I'm diving into in my dissertation of exactly what happens to Santokh Singh. But some eyewitness accounts mention that when he's strolling into Amritsar, he's not well, and he passes away shortly after he provides that text to the Akal Takht. So this is why actually the text is so interesting, is because this is written just at the cusp, right? Like this is the peak of the pre-colonial text. Like he's literally writing, the British are on the doorstep and now they're in the house, and then he closes off his text, which makes this text so interesting, because it's like it's a pre-colonial text, and it's just like, all right, now the British are here. And then 100 years after that, Veer Singh publishes it, in the height of the Singh Sabha era, when you would imagine that this text would receive a lot of criticism. Some criticism we'll talk about today, and Veer Singh does his best to kind of refute those, or contextualize that.
Did Kavi Santokh Singh Ji have any children, and what happens to his lineage?
Yes, yeah, he had so he got married at a late age in those days. I think he got married at 35 when he came to Kathol. So in those days that was quite late. He ended up having something like 7-8 kids. His eldest had a manuscript. So when he passed away, there was about 4 or 5 manuscripts at that time. His eldest took one manuscript to Anandpur Sahib, and he began doing katha there every day, his eldest son. So he was training his kids and he was training people in the Gurdwara, and this is something we can talk about, his kind of routine there in Kathol, where he would wake up in the morning, he would do his Path Puja, and then in the morning, he would write, he would study, and then in the afternoon, he would sit down with his lakharis, his scribes. He had 4, and he would write the text. We'll go into that a little bit with more detail later on, but anyways, he would do katha in the evening, and so he would train people on katha as well. He would take questions, those back and forth and stuff as well. So yeah, he had descendants. The descendants had manuscripts. They would do katha of it. And his family still lives on today. He actually married outside of caste. This is what Veer Singh writes. Anyways, so he has a very interesting story. Like, he's from a low caste. He marries outside of caste when it comes to Kathol. He has a lot of kids. The kids continue on, with his katha. His kids get threatened later on, Veer Singh writes about, because of certain components of that text, like the Devi Prasang, the stories about Chandi, etc. So yeah, it's Santokh Singh's story is just really fascinating.
As you've been talking, I kind of feel as though in some ways you could compare Kavi Santokh Singh Ji to Herodotus, in that he's like one of the first big historians who looks at all of the source material before him. But at the same time, it also feels like he is perhaps kind of just an evolution in a tradition that has already existed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends what we mean by history, but I think just a very brief Sankhep way of thinking about this is like, from the 1600s, you have Bhai Gurdas. He is, the star that shines brightest in that era in terms of Sikh literature outside of the Gurus. And then you have, in the 1700s, you have Bhai Mani Singh, and his works, Sikhani Bhagatamala, just a gem, expands on Bhai Gurdas's work. So Bhai Gurdas, in his 11th Var, his 11th ballad, he writes just the names of the Sikhs from, the first Guru Nanak Dev Ji, to Guru Hargobind. And there's no real explanation who those Sikhs were, what the kind of back and forth with the Gurus were, what the history is. So Sikhs asked Bhai Mani Singh in the 1700s, can you tell us about, these people? Bhai Mani Singh has inherited these stories from, staying with Mata Sundari, Mata Sahib Devan, Guru Gobind Singh, etc. So he then writes Sikhani Bhagatamala. He also has Guru Bilas Bachai Chemi written, Guru Bilas Bachai Dasmi written. It says in these texts, Bhai Mani Singh says to me, and then he's writing. So in the 1700s, you have Bhai Mani Singh, and then in the 1800s, you have Santokh Singh, which is taking Bhai Mani Singh's works and the Janam Sakhis and then writing on those. So I would say Santokh Singh is more of following in the tradition of seeing what's before him, and curating that in a in a way that relates to his audience at that time, which is what Mani Singh was doing, is what Bhai Gurdas was doing as well. And then people after him, like Veer Singh, are also doing the same thing. When they take what Santokh Singh has written and then write it in really like simple Punjabi for people to read at that point. So, all of these people are kind of following in that tradition. But there's different styles of literature through these, and that's something that Santokh Singh had to struggle with, or had to think about when curating, at least, because the Janam Sakhi literature is a little bit different than what you have in the Gurbalas literature. The Janam Sakhi literature is not as concerned with chronology. It's not as concerned with kind of dates. And Gurbalas literature marks a little bit of a change in that regard, where you have more structured dates and a kind of a A to Z in terms of a history. So, and he's trying to curate all of that into one prabandha, one kind of collective narrative.
So would it be fair then to say that the different styles of literature that appear at different points reflect the state of the Sikh community? So the Janam Sakhi literature is concerned perhaps more with the philosophical teachings of a great mystic, the Gurbalas literature coming much later on, when the whole community is more concerned with dates and times.
Yeah, and this is going to go also into one of your questions about what inspires Santokh Singh to do what he did, is that he writes at the beginning of his text that he, in his looking at Sikh history, especially the Janam Sakhis, he's thought that there is some malavat, there's some kind of exterior information that has been put into there that kind of doesn't make the Guru's praise shine as brightly as it should. So he is thinking that he's going to curate the history in a way that is without any of this nonsense. So he's also taking bits that he thinks are appropriate, and he's curating that as well. So in the same way, like Mani Singh is doing, he's trying to take what's before him and kind of present it so that the audience at that time has a better understanding of the Guru's history.
In relation then to the Santokh Singh Ji's works and his curation of his work, how does he go about picking his sources and then also deciding what to include and what not to include?
So, my dissertation work is largely focusing on this kind of reverse engineering Santokh Singh's works, which is what Veer Singh tried to do as well. When he's looking at Suraj Prakash, Veer Singh is kind of looking at the previous texts, Guru Balash Pachai Chemi, Daswin, Janam Sakhis, and kind of trying to figure out, okay, what components align with what. And you can see, like, for example, I'm looking at, in the Swedish podcast, the stories of Guru Hargobind, and those relate to the stories written at the behest of Bhai Mani Singh and Guru Bilas Pachai Chemi. And you can see the exact same structure, or very similar, in very similar tropes, idioms, metaphors used in Guru Bilas. Santokh Singh himself is using as well in Suraj Prakash. The same type of stories, the same type of emotion. For example, like when Guru Hargobind has to, in battle, kill Pandey Khan, who is somebody that the Guru himself raised. The Guru starts to tear up. This is not Santokh Singh's, masala adding to this. This is written also in Guru Bilas Pachai Chemi as well. So, this is something that I'm doing in my work, is kind of figuring out what texts were available to him, what he was using. But it is clear that he was using those Guru Bilas texts, the Guru Bilas Pachai Dasmi, Pachai Chemi. He's using Mema Prakash, he's using the Janam Sakhis, he's using Sikhandi Pagatmala. You can tell when you have these side by side what he's using. But, as mentioned before, he studied under Sant Singh. Sant Singh in the Gyanya Bunga would have had all of these texts of Mani Singh available to him, and more than likely Mehma Prakash as well, that have come from Guru Amar Das Ji's lineage. So, in short, this is something that I'm going to kind of slowly kind of expand on through my research. But Veer Singh does write that he has all of those texts, as mentioned, available to him.
Where are any of the original manuscripts, if they still exist?
Also something I'm trying to dive into. Veer Singh himself writes that he was not able to find at that point the original. Veer Singh talks about how Santokh Singh wrote this. So just to clear something up here, Veer Singh comes a significant time after Santokh Singh passes away, right? So Veer Singh is hearing these stories from his elders. So his Nanaji, so his maternal grandfather, was like an expert on Suraj Prakash and had written many notes, Gyani Hazara Singh. He's also studied under the same school that Santokh Singh studied, Gyanya Bunga. And so Hazara Singh has notes. Veer Singh mentions this, like his grandfather made notes of it, so he's putting it in his published publication of Suraj Prakash. Veer Singh goes around, he talks to people from Kathol and other people in the community about how Santokh Singh compiled it, how he wrote it. Santokh Singh is sitting in Kathol. He's sitting in his Haveli, which is just recently purchased actually by Gani Sher Singh. And he has 4 lakaris, he has 4 scribes, and he sits there, as mentioned before. He kind of studies the text likely in the morning, and then he sits with his lakaris, his scribes. He has some type of little pot or like a drum with him, and he sits there and he is playing this beat on it. And as he plays this beat, Santokh Singh does, which is according to the chand, the type of meter that he's writing in. So for example, like a dohra or chopai or savaiya, he's then reciting the poetry just like that to his lakaris. And every now and then it says he has a little cup of dig that he's drinking as he's writing it, as Veer Singh writes. So, which he would call Navratana. So he's sitting there, and he also mentions that there's a bit of a parda, like a kind of a sheet in front of him and the lakaris, perhaps just to make himself feel more comfortable. I'm not exactly sure the meaning behind that, but Santokh Singh's sitting there, he's playing this beat, and according to the beat, he's reciting the poetry, and the lakaris then would write what he's saying. And then he would go in that afternoon or evening to the local gurdwara, and he would perform that katha. And then sometimes he'll get questions from the sangat. If earlier you said this, how does this make sense? And then you can see this in Suraj Prakash. There's a bit of dialogue in there. For example, in the stories of Guru Gobind Singh, those stories come from Bhai Ram Kaur, who stayed with the Guru and Huzur Sahib for some time. He's from Baba Buddha Ji's lineage. And at some point, he leaves Huzur Sahib to go up north back to his village, Baba Buddha Ji's ancestral village. And then there's some stories after that. And then the Sangat asks Santokh Singh, hey, like you mentioned, like Ram Kaur like went up north. How does he have these stories? And in it, he says that there's a response there that Ram Kaur then goes down to Delhi. He stays with the Matama, like the mothers, Mata Sundari, Mata Sahib Deva. There was Balu Hasana there, I believe. I could be wrong on his name. Udasi Sadhu. Udasi Sadhu was staying with Guru Gobind Singh for some time in Huzur Sahib. He was up in Delhi as well. He stayed with the Matama. Ram Kaur had this discussion with him. And it says, Ram Kaur's like, I spoke with him 4 times. I clearly remember these stories, and then so I'm conveying that to you now. So it's really funny how you see that kind of back and forth, and perhaps there was some editing there as well in terms of Santokh Singh is perhaps like we're trying to relate now in how we understand material construction. Like perhaps like stand up a comedian is going to test his material out on a crowd and then say, okay, that line worked. I'll change this line here and there. Perhaps that's what's happening, but Santokh Singh as a kathakar, as somebody who's doing katha, was renowned in that area as well.